Saint Antony of Egypt. He lived in the 3rd and 4th century, and it was in Upper Egypt at Memphis in Egypt, northern Africa. Now, and when he was quite young, and he inherited quite an estate from his parents who had died. And when he was in a sermon, he was listening, and then there was a story told about Jesus, and in that story, Jesus was saying to a rich person that person, maybe as an advice, how to get treasure in heaven, to sell what he had and give them the money to the poor. And then he would get treasure and richness in the heaven. Now, and Saint Antony of Egypt really understood that, the way he did it. And then he sold his estate and he gave the money to the poor, and he started to live then quite in poverty. He was only living on a rush mat, and he was only eating bread and salt and water, and he was only eating at night. Now, he wanted then to live more, even as Jesus did when he was 40 days in the desert, and he went to the desert for 20 years living there. He got 105 years old. So when he was 35, he went into the desert until he was 55. While he was in the desert, there are stories told about that Satan wanted to tempt him, and it is often the pictures in art that there were many animals climbing into the room, storming the room, all sorts of animals, leopards, scorpions, all sorts of animals, lions, whatever, all coming into the room. And then it's sometimes depicted that he was able to tempt these wild animals, and that is why he's the patronage of domesticated animals. Now, when he was 55, he went back. He would gotten from a friend bread and water where he was living in the caves in Egypt during the time. Now, he went back when he was 55, and many people wanted to get advice from him, and he had been disciples, and he was doing gardening and mat making. And he also was when asked about something, and his answer was then that he wanted to get the guidance of God, rather from the nature, which was always present, than reading books. And another of his maxims was that the best way to know God is to know oneself. And that is according to Malcolm Day's Treasury of Saints book on the pages 30 and 31. Hi and welcome. I am trying to learn Biographyology. Today is Saint Antony of Egypt, and after we've done that, we're going to do wrist training. And if you participate in the wrist training, then it's at your own risk. He lived in the 3rd century, and his feast day is the 17th January. We're reading that now for the second time. Patronage of desert monks and domestic animals, soft domestic animals. Paintings. Different one, all with the temptation of Saint Antony. And profile, desert hermit and early proponent of the domestic ideal. So he lived a good part of his life in the desert, and he was also a proponent. I don't really know what it means, but basically, what he did had an influence on how a proper monastic life should look like. Facts sometimes understated about this saint are his extraordinary long life of 105 years, and its crucial turning point when he was just 19. 6 months after inheriting a large estate near Memphis in Upper Egypt from his deceased parents, he heard in church the famous utterance of Jesus to the rich young man, "Go, sell what you have and give it to the poor, and you shall have treasure in heaven." To Antony the words came as though addressed to him personally. He went out, sold his possessions, and gave the proceeds to the poor. Then, in emulation of an old hermit living in the neighborhood, Antony took up the habit of an ascetic. I don't know what an ascetic is, or an emulation or something. What ascetic is, that he was living in Upper Egypt at Memphis, not Tennessee, Memphis in Upper Egypt, and but he was 19 when he was in church, and he had recently, 6 months earlier, from his parents inherited a large estate. He heard the words. I read a thinking, do I want to quote him exactly or just paraphrase? Maybe it's better paraphrase. Go sell what you have and give it to the poor, and you shall have treasure in heaven. Which Jesus says to the rich man. It has a different meaning than if it is said to a rich man, who is probably asking, now how it is recited here, how he should have treasures in heaven, or that a person lives in misery, the rich person. And I heard the story a couple of times, but I don't remember how it really was. It has a little different meaning. It is said to a rich person who wants to have treasure in heaven and feels probably misery right now on earth and asks for advice by Jesus, but I don't know the exact story. And there Jesus says, sell what you have, give the proceeds to the poor, and then you're going to have treasure in heaven. I think it's better if I paraphrase it. It's easier to understand. He ate only bread, and after he had sorted, he went to the desert. He had given the money to the poor. He ate only, first ascetic. He ate only bread and little salt and drank nothing but water. So only bread, salt and water. He never ate before sunset and slept on a rush mat on the floor. A rush mat, I don't know what it is, but it is a rush mat. He slept on a rush mat on the floor, water, salt, bread, and he only ate at night. Yearning to live a life still closer in union with God and to imitate Christ in the wilderness, Antony, at the age of 35, embarked on his famous flight from the world, which would last for 20 years. His home became a few caves at the top of a cliff in the Egyptian desert. To this barren refuge, I don't know, most people did not watch probably the previous parts, but we were talking a little about the meaning of barrenness, because I don't know it. But I know some poems with barren in the word, and it's always about the misery. And barrenness seems to be to not to get pregnant or not to be pregnant. It is used that way in the book. And here's the thought about a barren refuge, and they're talking about cliffs in the desert. But I still don't know what the word means. Now, to this barren refuge, a friend would bring him bread and water every 6 months. Now, when he lived at the life of an ascetic, the rush with water, salt and bread, but when he was 45, he decided to, inspired by the story of Jesus living for 40 days, I think was it, in the desert, and he went into the desert, lived in a cave for the next 20 years, having been brought bread and water every 6 months by a friend. The temptations of wild beasts. It was in this wilderness that Antony is said to have fought the wild beasts of temptation, the guises of Satan, as he interpreted them. In the biography of Antony, Saint Alphasius recorded his experience. It was as though demons were breaking through the four walls of a little chamber. All at once the place was filled with phantoms of lions, bears, leopards, bulls, of serpents and asps, of scorpions and wolves. The lurid temptations became favorite themes for painters. Some depicted the beasts as if they were rendered tame by this holy anchorite, pointing to his patronage of domestic animals. I don't understand the story behind it. Why Norwich should be Satan in guise, or in disguise, in guise? That you have a bunch of animals storming into the room. But I'm going to explain the story in the presentation. That he was Satan tempted him, and that there were all sorts of animals, lions, bears, leopards, bulls, serpents, asps, scorpions, wolves, storming into the room. That scene is one description about that. And that is made in many paintings, for example by Hieronymus Bosch or Jan de Brugge or Joachim Pettini. Is made in many different paintings. And the lurid temptations became favorite themes for painters. Some depicted the beasts as if they were rendered tame by this holy anchorite, pointing to his patronage of domesticated animals. And it is often been depicted that he was able to tempt these animals, and that is why he is the patronage of domestic animals. God in creation. Antony's interpretation of the true Christian life had won many followers who sought him out for advice. At the age of 55, he left his solitude to set up a monastery, one of the earliest known in Christendom, where he taught disciples. He lived by gardening and mat making, and until his dying day he looked for God's guidance in the natural world instead of in written matter. When asked how he could manage without the Bible, he pointed to the landscape and replied, "My book is the nature of created things, and it is present when I want to read the words of God." So when he was 55, he got back. He had many disciples who sought advice by him, and he was doing mat making and gardening, and he had the idea to get the guidance of God. out of nature which is always present rather than from reading books. The legacy of this nature-loving saint continued through an order founded around 1100, which became widespread over Western Europe, the Hospitals of St. Antony. Dressed in black robes with a blue cross, the monks would ring bells to attract alms and then hang the bells around the necks of animals to protect them from disease. A special privilege was given to this order's pick and honor in allowing them to wander free in the streets. Well, 1100 the hospitals of St. Antony, they were ringing with bells for alms, and when they got them, they were black with blue crosses. And after this, they're hanging the bells onto the necks of animals to protect them from diseases. Many monks sought Antony Abbot for spiritual advice. One of his maxims was that the first step to knowing God was to know oneself. So we're having the thing with the quote of Jesus, when that is searching guidance in nature instead of books, and first step to know God is to know oneself. And when the story of his life, going into the desert, coming back, and the story of the animals. I'm going to stop the camera. Saint Antony of Egypt. He lived in the 3rd and 4th century, and that was in Upper Egypt at Memphis in Egypt, northern Africa. Now, and when he was quite young, and he inherited quite an estate from his parents who had died. And when he was in a sermon, he was listening, and then there was a story told about Jesus, and in that story, Jesus was saying to a rich person that person, maybe as an advice, how to get treasure in heaven, to sell what he had and give then the money to the poor. And then he would get treasure and richness in the heaven. Now, in St. Antony of Egypt really understood that, the way he did it, and then he sold his estate and he gave the money to the poor, and he started to live then quite in poverty. He was only living on a rush mat, and he was only eating bread and salt and water, and he was only eating at night. Now, he wanted then to live more, even as Jesus did when he was 40 days in the desert, and he went to the desert for 20 years living there. He got 105 years old. So when he was 35, he went into the desert until he was 55. While he was in the desert, there are stories told about that Satan wanted to tempt him, and it is often the pictures in art that there were many animals climbing into the room, storming the room, all sorts of animals, leopards, scorpions, all sorts of animals, lions, whatever, all coming into the room. And then it's sometimes depicted that he was able to tempt these wild animals, and that is why he's the patronage of domesticated animals. Now, when he was 55, he went back. He had gotten from a friend bread and water where he was living in the caves in Egypt during the time. Now, he went back when he was 55, and many people wanted to get advice from him, and he had been disciples, and he was doing gardening and mat making, and he also was then asked about something, and his answer was then that he wanted to get the guidance of God, rather from the nature, which was always present, than reading books. And another of his maxims was that the best way to know God is to know oneself. And that is according to Malcolm Day's A Treasury of Saints book on the pages 30 and 31. I forgot the thing with the Alps and the bells. I don't have time to do the next step. Anyway, we don't have time for another thing. Maybe we're going to do it completely again, or we're going to do a separate video just about why St. Antony is, or St. Antony's origins to the Hospitaller of Antony, or whatever. Maybe we're going to do a separate video because I like the story kind of. Maybe we're going to do another video and I'm going to save it over the whole thing again. Whatever. Not now, we don't have time. If you were here for Biographyology, you can go to the next part of Biographyology, where we're going to do either St. Antony or the next saint, or the thing with hospital or whatever. If you stay here and participate in the wrist training, then it's at your own risk. Hold in stable stance, hands to the body, fists, and bring them down. Up the spotlight. My fists and to the middle. Outside. Middle. The flashlight. It wasn't fitting in the bow of the presentation. That's why I put it. And next exercise, the flat hands to the inside and outside. And flat hands with pancake flipper up. Yes, down. And now hands out. Down. And up. Now we're having 3 rules. The first rule is that we're stopping immediately as soon as there's pain. The second rule is that we're going only as far as we can go with a little bit of effort. Fists, inside, up. And the third rule is that we're not overdoing it. We just want to strengthen, not to exhaust. So you can take a break whenever you want. Flat hand, fist next to the body, down, press inside. Forward. Top. Outside. And the cautious becoming fingertips of one hand on top of the other one, out slowly, and cross against one. And out again. And now, flat hands and bend the middle knuckles. The buckle bridge exercise. Out again, bend the knuckles. And now, the frog testing of water temperature. Down again. Down. And now, flat hands and make claws. Try to bring the fingers apart. And the I6, flat hand, bend the little knuckles and press on all 4 fingers. Other hand, down and press on all 4 fingers. And the 4 days nuancen rätta. We're ending open and go with moderate pressure of the middle part of the lower arm. The claw. Outside. And the better pose for wrist training. I thank you very much and get to this.